I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. School safety has long been a point of high anxiety for students, teachers, administrators, parents, and even society in general. But school safety measures are expensive, and generally, they have followed high profile tragedies. They may prevent subsequent incidents, but it is like measuring deterrence. How do you know what didn't happen? In Montgomery County, Maryland, John F. Kennedy High School in Aspen Hill, on the east side of the county, poorer and more diverse than West County, has become the poster child of school safety problems. The school has been in the news for fights, knives, sometimes guns, drug use, bullying. In June 2024, at the urging of the school community, MCPS ordered a safety audit, which made recommendations that were estimated to cost $400,000, not including common maintenance fixes like broken doors. Some changes like extra security staff are already in place, but the community is awaiting a makeover of its security culture. Leadership change is imminent. I asked Kennedy High School Parent Teacher Student Association, the PTSA president, Ricky Ribeiro, about where things stand and what he hopes will happen. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning, especially when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Cat Scan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C. Paul Chaperas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album, reflecting the time and this cultural moment, is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. Ricky Ribeiro, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you for having me.
You are the PTSA president at John F. Kennedy High School. There have been several incidents of presence of guns, fights. As a PTSA president, what has been your sense of where you're at with security?
What I see is a situation of neglect, a situation of dismissiveness, I think, and this is not a new narrative. A lot of people who live in East County feel this way, of a community that's just left to fend for itself. And, you know, when we raise those needs, it's either minimized or pushed away. I will say that while Kennedy certainly has had a lot of issues, we are not an outlier. And I initially thought that the state of safety and security at Kennedy was due to the socioeconomic and racial demographic makeup of the school. But as BCC proved, that's not the case. BCC has a higher white student population, has far more resources, and they're dealing with exactly the same issues. So it is an issue that I think is not it can affect everyone and has affected every school community, whether that school community is majority white, majority minority, rich, poor. School safety is an issue that's showing up everywhere.
It is, but Kennedy is unique. There was a security audit done
Yes.
by MCPS last June. What does the audit report say?
That audit was the result of hard advocacy on our parts to get a real objective verified record of what was wrong or what was going on in the school. Because as parents, we're not in the school every day, of course, so we don't. We know what our kids tell us when they come home, but obviously we wanted the system to do the work of actually doing an audit. And that audit came after our last community town hall on safety and security in April, after a student, a non-Kennedy student, entered the building with a knife and attempted to assault a Kennedy student. And so one of the things that was discussed by the community and was asked and then was followed up was that we get an audit of our school to know what the vulnerabilities are, what the issues are, and then with the intention of, with that audit, the school system would now know all of the things that it needed to fix and would fix them. What the audit found was a lot of structural deficiencies. I'm talking broken doors, broken locks, broken cameras, but it also did really important work of doing the audit when the school building was in use. So figuring out the hot spots where students were congregating, where illicit activity was happening, both inside the school building and around it, including the parking garage, the track area or the football stadium. And it really gave us, honestly, a very clear sense of what was going on, what we could do to fix it. And I felt like with that audit in hand, that we would be onto a better path for the school.
A part of the audit report says that there is a problem with the culture of safety and security at Kennedy. How do you think about that?
It's one of the things I've been complaining about a lot. And I think the culture is not unique to Kennedy. I think it's MCPS. There is a culture that exists within all MCPS. Well, I shouldn't say all. There's a culture that is common in many MCPS schools when there's bad things happening to not talk about it, to minimize it, to sweep it under the rug, to make it go away. And what I have encountered is there's this intense pressure, I believe, that is placed on principals to preserve the MCPS brand. As you know, Montgomery County Public Schools has a history and a track record of being a, quote, good school system. And so no principal, from my observation, wants to be the school that's having the kinds of things that our school is having. And so there's attempts to, if it happens, not have to report it, or if you report it minimally, or if we can blame the media or the parents who are complaining about it as being the problem, as opposed to the problem being the things that are happening in the school that are leading to the media coverage and the parent outrage, or address it quickly and write it off as a one-off incident, as opposed to a concerning pattern that you need to do some root cause analysis for and probably change some personnel, some practices, or maybe ask for resources that you don't currently have. That's the culture that I'm talking about.
You grew up in MCPS.
I did. Born and raised Tacoma Park. Born in Tacoma Park and then lived around many towns, Damascus at one point, Germantown for my middle and high school years.
When you were growing up in MCPS, this wasn't bad like this.
No, and I'm not saying that to say that nothing bad ever happened. There were fights in middle school. I was actually part of the inaugural class of Roberto Clemente Middle School, and it was a brand new building, and I remember being so excited. And it was also at the time when MCPS had made the switch to sixth grade being the start of middle school. Back before elementary, sixth grade was part of elementary school.
Sure.
So it was an exciting time. And I remember that was the first time when I got to middle school that, I saw fights. And so there were fights that happened, but it was all fist fights, nothing to the level of what I'm seeing now, where like kids are getting jumped, where there's weapons like guns and knives. The worst thing I remember hearing about in high school was cigarette smoking, drinking, and then some marijuana. But I mean, it was so distant. It would happen off campus usually. Kids would go to the woods near the school. I don't remember any of that stuff really happening inside of the school. And look, I'm not saying that my experience was the universal, because I've heard other people say, oh, yeah, I remember some drugs being sold in school and this happened. But I don't recall it to the level that I'm seeing it now.
Where do you think the leadership at the school, how have they seen the problem?
That's been a point of contention. I'll be honest. The current principal, I think she has wanted to preserve and present an image of the school to obviously convey that things are under control. I don't feel that things were, and I don't think that's my opinion. It's based on the things that have made the news. And I believe in dealing with reality versus a desired reality or an alternate reality. And I don't know that that was always a shared worldview. Well, I will also say that our current principal has announced after the lockdown incident that she will be retiring. She admitted that the retirement was earlier than she had anticipated. To be fair, the school had safety incidents that preceded her in terms of leadership failures. It is not only on her. And I would say that also it goes above her, right? Because the principals have directors and the directors have associate superintendents, and ultimately the buck stops with the superintendent. So
You said the lockdown incident. Can you describe what happened?
this was January 23rd. There was a report of a student attempting to overdose by medication earlier that day that led to a shelter in place. And then I want to say about an hour and a half later, during the lunch period, there was the lockdown was called after students reported a student having a gun on them to, I believe, security staff. And so that day, I got the call from the school, and then of course the remind messages during the lockdown that they're still in lockdown. And I didn't get, it's not like I got more information than that when it was happening. From what I have heard since then, I have heard that the lockdown had issues. I have heard that the scene was chaotic. I have heard that during the lockdown, kids who weren't supposed to leave the building were leaving. So it raises questions about how protocols and procedures are actually implemented, because a lockdown is supposed to prevent movement. And as a result of some of those procedures not being followed, the student and the student with the weapon and the student who had the weapon were not found. This was not unique to Kennedy. A very similar situation happened at BCC, where by the time the lockdown was called, the student with the weapon had already left the school. And so that was it sounds like that was similar at Kennedy.
BCC stands for Bethesda Chevy Chase High School, which is in Bethesda. So when the student left, both at Kennedy or at BCC, did they know the identity of the student? Did they find the student later on?
My understanding is that in both instances, they did not find out who the student was until after they had called the lockdown. So again, by the time they've called the lockdown, that student has already left the building. By the time they had identified who the student was, they're gone. So there's nothing you can do.
What do you mean nothing you can do? You can't visit them at home?
Well, the school wouldn't. This is where I don't know. You would have to talk to the police. I would assume that MCPS would alert the police immediately, and then the police would follow up. If that happened, where that may or may not have broken down, I think MCPS should answer. But that is my understanding, is that by the time the student in both incidents was identified, they had already called the lockdown, and that student was off the premises.
I've heard that it took too long to put in the lockdown.
That is what I have heard as well. I have heard there was a delay. I'm not sure exactly, but I've heard of around 30 minutes from the incident being reported.
So they couldn't find the student. They locked down too late. During lockdown, people were moving in and out.
Yep.
So really, it's a wholesale breakdown.
Correct.
Did anybody take responsibility for that?
I think the closest was Chief of Schools, Peter Moran. At our community town hall, he admitted that MCPS has failed the Kennedy community, and that the level of safety and security that we have received has not been what the school system would hope and aspires to give the community. So that's the closest I've gotten.
Very typically, almost several issues, whether it's learning or security or anything else in MCPS, there's a tension between where responsibility lies. Is it the school building and the school leadership, or is it the central office?
Yes.
In your view, was this a school leadership failure, or was this a central office failure? The school is supposed to run a lockdown efficiently.
I believe it's a system failure. There's a lot of silos and finger pointing and infighting that I observed. And so you have the Office of System Wide Safety and Emergency Management having some roles and responsibilities. You have the Office of School Improvement, OSSI. Sorry, I'm used to the acronyms. And there's like infighting about who's supposed to do what, and then to your point, there's also the tension of central office versus the school-based leadership. I will tell you that I think there's enough blame to go all around, and there's probably not any one person who's to blame. But the breakdown and the dysfunction and the infighting and the silos is what manifests, and that's what leads to situations like what we're in.
In the audit report, there was also a note that security staff believe that students get no consequences when they are brought into the office for some violation of the student code of conduct. Is that a school-based problem, or is that still broader?
One of the things that I've learned in my advocacy is how political all of this stuff is. So some of this now gets into the state because, as you know, the state of Maryland has instructed local education agencies, LEAs, to use restorative practices. So it's hard to say the root cause. I will say that there has been a significant shift away from traditional discipline to more restorative, and some would argue soft or forgiving responses to student misbehavior. And there's multiple forces for why that is happening. But that report did indicate that discipline or response to student misbehavior from the administration might not have been sufficient.
Do you think that restorative practice, which is fairly popular and widespread, is counter to running a school safely?
I would like to believe that children are able to be rehabilitated and restored from poor choices and poor decisions. But I also think when you apply it incorrectly, or if you don't know what you're doing, you can cause more harm than good. Because I also think there are some things that you can't just wipe away with an apology. For example, I was reached out to by a mother whose daughter was pepper sprayed by a student at John F. Kennedy High School. And I don't think a restorative circle makes that mother and her child feel okay about that incident. And so the question is, restorative practices, if implemented with fidelity, do they have a role? Perhaps. If so, where and at what level of offense? And how do you develop a system that does that correctly? And then are teachers and is the school-based staff even equipped to do that kind of work? Because it sounds like therapy and sounds like something that somebody with a very deep background in counseling and mental health would need to facilitate. And I just don't know that the school system is set up to do it well.
One of the most common ways of clamping down on violations of safety is to close down bathrooms. What is the situation in Kennedy with respect to how many bathrooms they've closed down? What are they doing about that?
Yeah, so the bathrooms is actually how I got my start in advocacy in this area. Because back in 2022, the 2022-2023 school year, my kids came home from school complaining like the bathroom smells weird. There's kids in there smoking stuff, and it makes my head hurt. I was sent pictures of what was literally aluminum foil with burnt Percocets in it. And I reached out to the principal at the time and asked.
How did you know it was Percocet?
Well, that's what they told me. And I had the picture and then I followed up and I asked the principal, I said, this is what I'm hearing. Is it true? It's like, yeah, we've been finding that they're smoking they're crushing it up and smoking the Percocets in the bathroom. And I'm thinking, well, you must not have known. So now that I've told you, like, you're going to do something about it, right? Like you're going to like immediately swoop into action, call law enforcement, like get that, that won't happen again. And no, that wasn't the case. Drug use happened with quite regularity to the point that in the 2022-23 school year, John F. Kennedy experienced something like 4 back-to-back student overdoses at the school. We had reports of students witnessing students overdosing in the bathrooms. There was actually also some hate. There was a threat of a school shooting that was written in the bathroom, hate graffiti, all kinds of things. And so the bathrooms was really the inflection point for me to get into this issue, because it was where I started to realize that things seemingly had gone off the rails, and there wasn't a sufficient response. When I brought up the issue initially, the principal's response was, "Yeah, we're taking the doors off the bathrooms." And I was like, okay, not sure how that helps, but okay, maybe you know more than me. And then after that didn't work, then we started hearing about locking bathrooms. So it was very prevalent, I would say, 2 years ago. Today it happens, but from what I understand, it happens more in response to an incident, as opposed to being a consistent policy that they're locked all the time. But that's my vantage point. I'm not in the school.
From the audit report, it became clear that students were not attending class.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were in wrong classes. Some of them were hiding in bathrooms. Some of them had left the campus. How do you think of the attendance problem?
The school system doesn't do a good job, in my opinion, of establishing the definitions of a closed campus and actually enforcing what it calls a closed campus. Because John F. Kennedy High School, for the entire time that my son has been there, was technically a closed campus, and yet children had free movement, and it wasn't even just children. That the scary thing is even we've had reports of adults or non students and staff entering the building as well. There doesn't seem to be a real strong enforcement of what it means for a school to be a closed campus. There's also the other side of the problem, where there are a select group of schools in MCPS that are open campus, and there's been a lot of debate and conversation about whether it's safe and whether schools should allow for open campus policies. And I believe BCC is one of the schools that does have an open campus, because they're in an urban district, and I believe the kids are allowed to go out for lunch, and they're supposed to come back. But again, the school doesn't really have strong mechanisms for managing, for enforcing, and handling all of that. And so we have these terms, closed campus, open campus, that don't really mean anything, because in practice, every campus is an open campus, or many campuses, I should say, in MCPS are open campus. And so to your point about attendance, one of the things about adolescents is they're built to test boundaries. And I think what has happened is MCPS has lots of policies that exist on paper, but not in practice. And so if you have rules that you don't consistently enforce, the kids will test and break them. And once they get away with it, they're going to tell their friends, and then their friends are going to tell their friends. And if you don't have leadership, school leadership, that you hold accountable for, rules not being enforced, then I think you get to a place where attendance rates are soaring. And it gets out of control. And I will say it's not solely a school problem. Obviously, parents are partners in this conversation. So it's important to make sure that the school parent connection is also healthy, and that it's also functional. But I will tell you, as a parent, I send my son to school. I have no idea if he's made it to class or not, right? Like, he's in high school, so he has 7 different classes. The only way I would know if he didn't make it to class is maybe if I get an alert from the school system at the end of the day. And usually it's a generic AI thing that says your child may have missed blah, 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 period, or may have been marked absent during the day. And one of two things happens. Either it's a false positive because some substitute didn't have the login to go in and mark that he actually was attended, or he actually was skipping and I didn't know, and I don't know which class he might have missed. You can see that in parent view now, so that's an improvement. But it's a whole mess. I think the attendance data is not even, the policies are not enforced with fidelity. The data is not great. The systems for notifying parents aren't great. So I think attendance is also a mess.
How would you like this problem fixed?
I don't think MCPS wants to admit how much of the attendance issue might be due to its lax enforcement policies and maybe inadequate leadership. Because when they talk about, and I watch, like, I'm one of those weirdos, I watch council meetings, I watch board meetings, and so I follow them when they talk about this. And what they often say is they will start with the most sympathetic reason for why kids might miss school, which is that lower income families have to watch siblings, they might have to work. That is true. I am not dismissing that. But what they don't do is actually take the data and say, hey, this school that has a 50% chronic absenteeism rate, we believe 10% is due to having to meet family needs like watching a younger sibling or work.
But how would they determine that?
They have the attendance data, they have the pupil personnel workers, they have the counselors, they have the wellness centers, they have the admin teams, they have the teachers. I mean,
So basically go interview the family.
which is what they say, by the way, which is how they say they're responding to it, right? They say that if your child misses a certain number of classes, they're going to call your parents and then potentially do home visits and create an individualized attendance plan. So this is what they say that they're going to do.
They don't have the staff to do it.
No, they don't, but they keep saying that they're going to do it.
So is this merely an expectation setting problem?
I think MCPS has never been challenged to actually have to enforce its policies at the levels that we're seeing, some of which are absolutely due to post-pandemic expectations being softened, and people just in general feeling like missing school is not as big of a deal as it once was. And actually, the New York Times did a great report about how that is a nationwide trend.
I guess the question is MCPS problem right now that it is not setting the right expectation, a reasonable expectation, that they cannot actually interview every family where a student is chronically absent. Their biggest error is that they make a promise, can't keep it.
I believe that is a huge part of the problem. I think they have made promises that I don't know how they would be able to keep, because to your point, that would take an army of staff that would have to be dedicated to just chasing down students and visiting families and home visits. And I'll remind you that I think I'm going to speak to high schools because I can't remember if every school has it, but they have one attendance secretary. John F. Kennedy High School has 1,800 students. How could one attendance secretary follow up with 1,800 kids? So to your point, the promise is not wise to make because you don't have the resources to actually make good on the promise. Furthermore, this is another thing, and I've heard from lots of parents who rightfully say, well, I don't know why it's a big deal to miss school because they're not teaching my kid anyways. My kid says they're watching YouTube videos, or they finish the work in 10 minutes and they are left to be on their devices. So what's the big deal? So again, this also goes to the system failing to actually serve its mission of actually educating people, and people responding by saying, well, I'm going to opt out and go when it's convenient for me and not for you.
But that's correct. I think you're right about your instinct in this respect. The net result, however, is that parents are themselves lax, but expecting the school system to deliver something that they cannot do themselves. It's the same thing with cell phones, by the way, right? It's a similar thing with cell phones, because we give our kids the phones and then go, okay, school, take care of it.
Right. So listen, and I will say it's a partnership issue, and I think there are some parents that definitely I agree, because if you're giving your kid the phone, but then you want the school to police the phone, well, you could also not give your kid the phone.
In all of this, have you been concerned about cyberbullying?
Yes.
Prior to the pandemic, there was a massive talk about cyberbullying and how that was upsetting people.
So it's all connected, though, right? So some of the fights that we're seeing in schools are fueled by cyberbullying, right? Like I saw you say something about me on pick your platform, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever, and then a confrontation erupts because that has now circulated and you're humiliated and you have to preserve your dignity. I had come across several fight pages on Instagram that students had set up at various schools, one of which was Springbrook High School, which recently came across my view in February.
But it's not included in the safety audit. It's not included as a part of a safety plan.
Nope, it's not.
Given all of this, what is your experience? What is your thinking about the learning that happens at Kennedy?
There are great teachers at the school. However, objectively, if you look at the academic outcomes for the school, they're not great. Test scores tend to have more to do with socioeconomic background. There's a debate about how much schools can reverse the impacts of socioeconomic environments.
I imagine teachers are constrained in a very big way by the safety issues. Do they complain about it?
Yes, several of the people that in my advocacy, I have built many relationships with teachers who have expressed and shared their experiences, their viewpoints. They have been some of my closest allies and advocates in this work.
So Dr. Taylor came in last year with new ideas, new energy. Do you think that he has made any movement in the direction you are hoping for?
One thing Dr. Taylor has done that I am in alignment with is he has put in his budget request a significant increase in safety assistance. Now, I don't know what the plan for those assistants is. I don't know how he arrived at the number that he arrived, nor do I know what impact he is anticipating that number of security assistants, if added to the system, will be. What I haven't seen that I've wanted to see from him is an understanding of the sense of urgency that multiple school communities have at this point expressed to him. Again, Kennedy is one, BCC is another. I know at Northwest High School, there was a similar town hall when a student was arrested off campus after being accused and charged, I believe, of committing assault or murder or attempted murder. So there's a lot of school communities that have, and how can I forget Magruder, right? Like Magruder, which was like, to me, that was the 9/11 of school safety for MCPS. And it boggles my mind that moment did not, was not followed by a dramatic shift in the school system's approach to safety and security. So I have not seen the shift in vision and mindset from him that I would have liked.
If a parent wants to make sure that something is reported, they should call the Maryland School Safety Hotline. Is that correct?
That's what I have learned, and that's what I would recommend. Relying solely on MCPS and its systems, things get lost. And I think that Beidelman proved that, right? Like MCPS got in so much trouble because its internal systems failed, because people reported via official channels and it did not get recorded or it did not get acted upon. And so I highly recommend that people report through the state's channels, because those have documentation outside of the school system.
Do you also recommend reporting to the police every time something happens?
I won't say every time, but I think a lot of parents don't realize that they should probably be reporting to the police. And I think they don't realize that, for example, if your child gets into a fight, right? This principal and the school system might code it as a fight. You might believe, and legally it might be classified as assault, but the school system is not going to do the work for you to go to the police and say, hey, a child was assaulted in our school building. You as the parent have to do the work to go to the police and say, hey, I would like to file a claim that my child was assaulted. And then you as the parent have to move forward to make that happen.
The school system is not automatically going to report that to the police as an assault. Is just shocking.
Yeah, because there's a threshold of what they're required to report, and I believe it's if the victim has such bodily injury that they have to be cared for outside of the school at a hospital, right? So like if your kid gets into a fight or is assaulted, but they haven't broken a bone, they're not bleeding profusely, they'll tell you, oh, your child was involved in a fight, this is what happened, and you might think, oh, well, since it's a fight and they didn't say it's assault, that you can't follow up on it as assault, but you absolutely can. But you have to do that work yourself with the police. The system won't do it for you.
Has MCPS started a new search for a principal?
Yes, the search has begun. We are actually having community meetings kicked off this week. And so the search is on. We're doing it again.
Ricky Ribeiro, good luck with the search. Good luck in your son's high school. Good luck advocating at MCPS.
Thank you, Sunil. Appreciate it.
What lessons should we draw from my conversation about school safety with Kennedy High School PTSA President Ricky Ribeiro? First, it is important to note that the evolution and breadth of what we call school safety. Middle and high schools have always had fights. Football games have long broken out into brawls. Physical hazing is down today. There are surveys showing 60% of high school students smoked marijuana in 1980. That number is down to 14% now. As a general matter, not tied to schools, young people are physically safer today than they were in the 1970s, in large part because parents now helicopter, kids are sequestered and glued to their smartphones. What has become worse are school shootings, students having access to guns, particularly ghost guns, which are put together from assembly kits available online and carry no serial numbers. Mental health and suicide ideation have become worse. Cyberbullying is a whole new area of insecurity that didn't even exist 20 years ago. And as Ricky Ribeiro says, cyber and school fights cross over. If you watch some of these fights, they even seem to be engineered to garner online clicks. Within a shorter time frame, say the last 10 years, before and after the pandemic, there have been bigger swings. Whereas prior to the pandemic, mental health, cyberbullying, and opioids were the main concerns, the situation after the pandemic seems mainly about crossover fights and discipline. Smoking opioids like Percocet, as Ribeiro mentioned, is part of a longer trend that includes fentanyl use and remains an issue. The safety situation inside of a school is also connected to street crime, like carjacking and retail theft, which have been attributed to school age juveniles. But crime in all these categories outside schools is now down, even homicides, which inexplicably increased after the pandemic. Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy has spoken about the success against ghost guns. But these successes have not percolated into public perception just yet. And inside some schools like Kennedy, Bethesda Chevy Chase, and Northwest High Schools, the situation may seem dire. If you are like me, interested in the political economy of policing, consider this idea: the social efficiency of enforcement. All laws are enforced unequally. There is variation in how unequal. Traffic citations are different from murder investigations, but there are differences within those categories. The social efficiency of law enforcement means that the benefit of enforcement exceed or at least equal the cost of enforcement. Metal detectors and cameras, but also random bag checks, invasion of privacy, and wrongful arrests. Since these costs and benefits are not objectively measurable, the cost benefit analysis is also subjective. And the side that holds the narrative tilts the balance to determine social efficiency of enforcement. Those who believe in restorative practice, which Ribeiro describes as being close to therapy, seek to tilt the balance one way. But without big investment in trained counselors, that is simply not available. Restorative practice often looks like lack of consequences and perverse incentives for offenders. One thing to keep in mind is that in all public policy, including school safety, the notion that Ribeiro talks about, that everyone is to blame and there is no one person to hold responsible, is a reason why action may not be forthcoming. To the extent everyone shares the blame and no one can be identified as being responsible, reform becomes an abstract notion rather than a concrete one. The biggest change coming to Kennedy is that the school is getting a new principal. Vicki Adamson, who came to Kennedy 2 years ago, having been at Bethesda Chevy Chase before then, is retiring. The search for a new principal is on. But it will take more than a new principal. MCPS, it seems, has an expectation setting problem. They set their goals high, perhaps aspirationally, perhaps to get political buy in, perhaps to be inclusive. But it turns out that the expectations are too high for the resources they have to meet their goals. And that, in the end, may be the ultimate source of the community's frustration with the school system. the failure to keep promises. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C., Paul Chaparas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album reflecting the time and this cultural moment is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.